Between 1935 and 1938, a killer moved through the shadows of Depression-era Cleveland, Ohio, leaving behind bodies that told investigators almost nothing. At least 12 victims, men and women, most of them nameless even today, were found dismembered and decapitated in a ravine called Kingsbury Run, a place where the desperate and forgotten came to sleep and never woke. The man assigned to stop the killer was Eliot Ness, already famous for bringing down Al Capone, and even he could not catch the butcher. 2 men were named as prime suspects. One died in custody before he could be tried, and the other was never charged, and the case was quietly, officially closed. Nearly 90 years later, the mad butcher of Kingsbury Run has never been identified with certainty, and the truth of what happened in that ravine remains buried. Welcome. You have found a channel devoted to going deeper into the case's history left unsolved, and tonight we are giving you our full investigation into the Cleveland torso murders. Stay with us, because somewhere inside this story, there is a shape that almost becomes a man, and when you see it, you will not easily forget it. Chapter 1. The Run Holds Its Secret. In September 1935, Kingsbury Run was a place Cleveland's prosperous citizens preferred not to think about. It was a deep industrial gulch running 3 miles through the east side of the city, a trench of clay, cinder, and neglect. Unemployed men had built shanty camps along its slopes, invisible people in a place the city had quietly erased. On September 23rd, 2 boys, James Wagner and Peter Costura, both teenagers, came down into the Run near East 49th Street. They were not the first children to play here, but they would be the first to find something they could not explain. The boys found human remains, 2 severed heads, and the bodies of 2 men drained of blood. Police from the Cleveland Department arrived within the hour, followed shortly by the county coroner, Arthur J. Pierce. The victims were male, both adults. Neither carried identification of any kind. One of the men was later identified as Edward Andrassy, 28, a hospital orderly with a troubled history. The second man was never identified, his name still unknown today. Detectives combed the ravine for 3 days and found no weapon, no witness, and no trail leading out. What no one yet understood, what would take weeks to surface, was that Kingsbury Run had already given up a body the previous year, and the city had not connected the two. Let's open the board. The location, Cleveland, Ohio, USA, and unknown, the prime suspect. Chapter 2. The Nameless and the Lost. Between 1934 and 1938, at least 12 people were murdered in and around Cleveland, Ohio. Only 2 of the 12 victims were ever given names. The first identified victim was Edward Andrassy, found in Kingsbury Run on September 23, 1935. Andrassy was 28, known to police, and lived at the margins of Depression-era Cleveland. The second named victim was Florence Polillo, identified in January 1936 by a rooming house neighbor. Polillo was a part-time barmaid who moved between cheap rooming houses on Cleveland's east side. The remaining 10 victims had no names, no addresses, no one who reported them missing. Investigators described them as transients, men and women who moved through the city's hobo camps and breadlines. In the depths of the Great Depression, Cleveland's population of drifters swelled into the tens of thousands. Detective Peter Merillo spent years circulating sketches and descriptions and found almost nothing. These were people the city had already lost before the killer ever found them. And investigators would later come to a terrible conclusion, that whoever chose these victims had understood that fact perfectly. On the board so far, unknown, the prime suspect. Now we pin up Frank Dolezal, the arrested suspect. Chapter 3. A Surgeon's Impossible Precision. In 1935, Cuyahoga County Coroner Arthur Pierce faced remains unlike anything his office had encountered. The bodies had been dismembered with extraordinary cleanliness. Each joint had been disarticulated precisely, not hacked, not sawed through randomly, but separated at the exact anatomical point. Pierce concluded that whoever had done this understood the human body with professional intimacy. The cuts suggested training, a surgeon, a skilled butcher, or someone who had studied anatomy with sustained purpose. Then came a detail more disturbing than the cuts themselves. Not one victim showed defensive wounds. No torn fingernails, no bruising consistent with a struggle. The victims, it appeared, had been incapacitated before the killing began. Toxicology in the 1930s was limited, but examiners noted chemical compounds in some tissue samples that could not be fully explained. These people had not fought back because, in all likelihood, they never had the chance. That meant the killer required privacy, space, time, and somewhere to work without interruption. Cleveland in 1935 was a city of over 900,000 people. But who among them had the anatomical knowledge, the sedating agents, and the invisible private space to do this again and again, undetected? On the board so far, Frank Dolezal, the arrested suspect. Now we pin up Eliot Ness, the lead investigator. Chapter 4. Eliot Ness steps into the dark. By 1935, Eliot Ness was already a legend. He had brought down Al Capone's empire before he turned 30. Cleveland's mayor, Harold Burton, appointed Ness director of public safety in December of that year. He arrived carrying the full weight of his own reputation. The city was modern, ambitious, and already hiding something monstrous. The first dismembered remains had surfaced along Kingsbury Run the previous September. Ness initially let his homicide detectives work it, confident the case would break. It did not break. As the body count climbed through 1936 and into 1937, Ness personally stepped into the investigation. For the first time in his career, the machinery of law enforcement produced nothing. Those who worked alongside Ness said the case changed something in him, that he carried it differently than other failures. What very few people knew was that Eliot Ness had privately settled on a suspect, a wealthy, well-connected man he believed was the torso killer, but that he would go to his grave without enough evidence to charge him. On the board so far, Eliot Ness, the lead investigator. Now we pin up Sep 1935, first two bodies found, Kingsbury Run. Chapter 5. The butcher leaves a message. By the summer of 1936, Cleveland had grown used to finding the dead in quiet places. But the discovery near Kingsbury Run in September changed something. The remains had not been hidden. They had been placed, deliberately, carefully, where they could not be missed. Investigators noted that the location offered a clear sightline to a well-traveled path. It was, one officer later said, as if someone had arranged a stage. Then, weeks later, a letter arrived at the Cleveland Plain Dealer. The writer claimed direct knowledge of the killings. The tone was controlled, even boastful. Handwriting analysts studied the letter for weeks and reached no firm conclusion about its author. No arrest followed. Eliot Ness, safety director of Cleveland, had read a copy of the letter. And the question that haunted investigators ever after was whether the butcher had written it directly for him. On the board so far, Sep 1935, first two bodies found, Kingsbury Run. Now we pin up Jan 1936, third victim discovered, decapitated. Chapter 6. The Wrong Man Confesses. By the summer of 1939, the Torso murders had gone unsolved for 4 years. The pressure on Cleveland authorities had become unbearable. In July 1939, Sheriff Martin O'Donnell's office arrested a bricklayer named Frank Dolezal. Dolezal was 52 years old, a quiet, unremarkable man who had once known victim Flo Polillo. After days of interrogation, Dolezal signed a confession. Investigators who examined it noticed something troubling. The confession contained details that were simply wrong. Dolezal described wounds that did not match the autopsy records on file. His ribs, it was later discovered, had been broken, likely during custody. On August 24, 1939, Frank Dolezal was found dead in his cell, hanged by a noose made from his own shirt. The cell walls were only 5.5 feet high. Dolezal stood 5 feet 8. Independent investigators and Dolezal's own family rejected the suicide verdict immediately. If Frank Dolezal was an innocent man silenced, the question is not who killed him, but who needed him dead. On the board so far, Jan 1936, third victim discovered, decapitated. Now we pin up Jules 1939, Dolezal arrested, later died in jail. Chapter 7. The Doctor Who Couldn't Be Touched. Among the thousands of names Eliot Ness examined, one kept surfacing: Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney. Sweeney was a trained surgeon, brilliant, physically imposing, and deeply unstable. He had the anatomical knowledge to do what the butcher had done, and investigators knew it. Sweeney was also the cousin of Congressman Martin L. Sweeney, one of Ness's most powerful political enemies. In May 1938, Ness arranged a secret interrogation, held not at a police station but at a private hotel. For several days, Sweeney was questioned using one of the earliest polygraph machines ever employed in a criminal case. According to those present, Sweeney failed the polygraph repeatedly. Yet Ness could not touch him. Polygraph results were inadmissible in court, and Sweeney's family connections made any prosecution politically catastrophic. Shortly after the interrogation, Sweeney voluntarily committed himself to the Sandusky Soldiers and Sailors Home, placing himself beyond legal reach. From inside, he began sending Eliot Ness handwritten postcards, taunting, cryptic, signed with his own name. The cards continued for years, long after Ness had left Cleveland, long after the killings had stopped. And what exactly they said has never been fully revealed. On the board so far, Jules 1939, Dolezal arrested, later died in jail. Now we pin up Aug 1938, Ness orders Kingsbury Run shantytown burned. Chapter 8, The Shantytown Burns. By the summer of 1938, Eliot Ness had no suspect, no motive, and no answers. The Kingsbury Run shantytown had sheltered hundreds of desperate men throughout the Depression. Ness had come to believe the killer lived among them, hidden in plain sight. On August 18, 1938, Ness ordered a full police raid on the encampment. More than 200 men were arrested, fingerprinted, and interrogated. Not one of them was charged with the murders. Ness then ordered the shantytown itself burned to the ground. Hundreds of homeless men lost the only shelter they had. Cleveland's newspapers condemned the raid as brutal and pointless. Critics argued Ness had punished the victims, not the predator. After August 1938, the Torso murders appeared to stop. But whether Ness had driven the killer away, or whether the killer had simply chosen to stop, was a question no one could answer. On the board so far, Aug 1938, Ness orders Kingsbury Run shantytown burned. Now we pin up a key clue: dismembered torsos, no heads. Chapter 9. The Case That Never Closed. The Cleveland Torso murders case was never officially closed. No one was ever charged, tried, or convicted. The suspect list remained contested, the killer's identity unproven. Eliot Ness left Cleveland in 1942, his reputation quietly fracturing. The man who had dismantled Capone could not explain a single Torso murder. He ran for mayor of Cleveland in 1947 and lost decisively. He died in 1957, largely broke, working for a small vanity press. His memoir, The Untouchables, was published just weeks before his death. The butcher, whoever he was, had outlasted the detective entirely. The official victim count stood at 12, but investigators always suspected more. In the early 2000s, forensic analysts began re-examining bone fragments and pathology records using modern DNA techniques. What they found suggested the true number of victims and the true identity of the killer may never have been what anyone believed. On the board so far, a key clue: dismembered torsos, no heads. Now we pin up a key clue: rope ligature marks on victims. Chapter 10. 12 Names Without Answers. Between 1934 and 1938, at least 12 people were killed in and around Cleveland, Ohio. Only 2 of those 12 victims were ever formally identified. The others exist today only as reconstructed facial models built from bone. Victim number 9, a woman estimated between 30 and 40 years old, has never been named. She was found near Kingsbury Run in the summer of 1936. Whoever killed these people possessed rare anatomical knowledge and moved without apparent fear of detection. Eliot Ness, Cleveland's safety director, investigated for 4 years and made no arrest. The killer stopped, or simply was never seen again. Decades later, criminologists and historians still debate whether the killer held a position of social protection. Someone with medical training, means, and privacy, killed in plain sight of a major American city. 10 of the 12 victims still have no name, no family who came forward, no grave marked with their own. And one name, a name Ness himself believed, was never proven, never prosecuted, and never fully buried. On the board so far, a key clue: rope ligature marks on victims. Now we pin up a key clue: Castile soap found near remains.